there is no evidence that Hunter Biden has received any kind of official favoritism in this prosecution for being Joe Biden's son. On the contrary, there are more than 10 million Americans who have filed taxes but failed to pay them, the exact crime Hunter Biden is pleading guilty to. The vast majority of these cases are resolved administratively or through civil settlement. Indeed, every year the IRS and DOJ obtain convictions and sentences in fewer than 700 cases for tax crimes of any kind, a minuscule percentage.
Here's what galls me. I don't like these attacks on the Department of Justice, the FBI, the IRS, as if they are somehow anti-U.S. agencies. Those agencies keep this democracy in check. It keeps them afloat. They provide the checks and they provide the balances. And yet we are doing this all over again for the Hunter Biden show to someone who has pleaded guilty and has taken responsibility for not filing taxes for 2 years. This is ludicrous. Beam me up, Scotty. There's no intelligent life down here. None. I yield.
And since January 6th, these Republicans and Trump have complained about a two-tiered justice system, co-opting the language of the decades-long civil rights movement for Black lives and Black freedom, a movement that they actually are actively looking to eliminate. There is a two-tiered justice system, but it's not about Democrats versus Republicans. This language, two-tiered justice system, has a real history. It has a real history of Emmett Till. It has a real history with Breonna Taylor. It has a real history with George Floyd, the Central Park Five, Derek Diaz, a young man who was just an unarmed young man who was just killed in Central Florida not but a week ago.
My Republican colleagues seem to think that using criminal law as a weapon or a political tool is objectionable only when directed against someone who should be out of reach of the criminal system, someone too rich, too powerful, or too white to be charged. But let's face it, that same system has been used as a weapon and a political tool against Black people since the Emancipation Proclamation. These racial disparities are rooted in a two-tiered view on race. The belief that Black people were inferior, that was created to justify the enslavement of Black people, which has now evolved to include the belief that Black people are more prone to criminality. During the decades of lynchings that followed enslavement, white people defended the torture and murder of Black people as necessary to protect property, families, and a way of life from Black criminals. In the 1980s, Nixon's war on crime evolved into Reagan's war on drugs, and we saw harsher and more frequent punishments and the start of mass incarceration. In both cases, it was Black people who were targeted and suffered under those policies. There's a reason that crack cocaine, which carries a stereotype of being used by Black people, was at one point punished far more harshly than powder cocaine. Prior to 2010, that ratio was 100-1, meaning someone convicted in a federal court of possessing crack cocaine will receive the same sentence as someone who possessed 100 times more powder cocaine. And I want to say that PA's extreme sentencing practices have overwhelmingly impacted people of color, but most specifically Black people, who make up less than 11% of the population in Pennsylvania, but more than 65% of those serving life without parole sentences and 58% of those serving non-life sentences of 20 years or longer. How many times have our elected officials and judges ran on a promise of a tough on crime approach? Even now, Republicans still tout that they are the party of law and order, while in the same breath claiming that Donald Trump should not be prosecuted. Don't get it twisted. Republican efforts to use the term two-tier justice is to distract from those who are truly the victims of a disparate treatment in our criminal justice system. And whether we say it out loud or not, we all know who those people are. I yield the remainder of my time to the ranking member.
Thank you, Ms. Lee, for that very eloquent statement. I wonder if you remember, you might.
And if we're going to talk about Ukraine and Burisma, let's remember that the President of the United States, not Joe Biden, Donald J. Trump, was impeached over a phone call to the President of Ukraine wanting to get dirt on this very subject, on this very individual, with this very company, and withheld military equipment desperately needed, as we now know, including Javelin missiles, which are very useful in anti-tank warfare, to get it, for which he was impeached, quite correctly. But my friends on the other side of the aisle all voted against that. They had no problem with that kind of interference that directly affected national security.
Mr. Ziegler and you shared concerns about delays related to the election cycle, but at that time, Joe Biden was not the president.
I believe at that time he was the nominee for president.
But, well, he was not the president, was he? It's just a simple question, sir.
Can you rephrase what time period?
Joe Biden was not the president in the presidential primaries in 2020.
Correct. That is correct.
Sir, finally, Mr. Shapley, you said that warrants were ready as soon as April 2020 to begin searching for records, but actions weren't taken with regard to those warrants. Again, Joe Biden was not the president in April 2020, was he?
So I'm confused by your line of questioning. We're talking about an election to which now President Biden was a part of. So he didn't have to be the president to have election meddling.
No, but the question is this. Was he the president at that time in April 2020?
It's been asked and answered.
And what's the answer, sir?
The election
The answer is yes or no?
Is no.
Thank you.
And,
Thank you. I yield back.
Mr. Chairman, may I finish?
Please, you may answer the question.
So, it's clear that he was not the president, but an election is for the purpose of electing a president. And Joe Biden at the time was a nominee for president of the United States. Therefore, the election clauses with DOJ policy took place and were in effect. And it wasn't until September 4th of 2020 that the Department of Justice Public Integrity said that we can no longer take any actions on that case. And in as early as April to June of 2020, the Department of Justice, Delaware U.S. Attorney's Office, was already invoking the election as a reason not to perform those search warrants.
Okay.
And that was Donald
and
Trump's
gentlemen's
DOJ.
time's expired. We've got a lot of questioners here. Chair now recognizes Mr. Jordan of Ohio.
You also testified that Assistant United States Attorney Leslie Wolf told you that you would get into hot water if interviewed the president's grandchildren. In other cases that you've worked over your career, have you ever had a prosecutor tell you that you couldn't interview a relevant witness?
So there are certain things that come into whether we talk to a witness or not. So if they're an attorney, if there's some special situation that might come up, that might cause caution to interviewing that witness. But I've never been told that we couldn't approach someone to interview them as a part of an investigation. Yeah, I mean, there's certain situations to where you have to do a further analysis of the information that you might get if they're, like I said, if they're an attorney. But yeah, so in this case, we needed to talk to witnesses related to things that were deducted on the tax return. And in this case, it was the adult children that we needed to talk to.
I just think because you have a history of wanting to charge people and then people pushing back. By your own testimony under oath, you said about 90% of the time people are pushing back on what you want to do. And I'm not questioning. I mean, you are a stickler for the law. You know, it reminds me of Les Mis and, you know, the famous person wanted to get the person who had a sandwich. I mean, and then all those times you've got people pushing back on you.
And when we talk about political influence, we are not here today, unfortunately, because the facts have brought us here. We are here today because Donald Trump is exerting an influence campaign in Congress when he is no longer president of the United States.
I know the American people are confused because we're all confused what we're doing here. Nothing this majority has claimed about the president or his family has merit. No wonder the folks back home are tuning out of this confused mess. My colleagues on the other side of the aisle have shredded all their credibility in this committee. They simply grasp at straws that do not exist.
But today's hearing is like most of the majority's investigations and hearings. A lot of allegations, zero proof, no receipts, but apparently some dick pics.
So, Mr. Chairman, I'm interested in whether you could commit in short order to holding a hearing about holding billionaires and big corporations accountable for evading their taxes. I think this could be a bipartisan hearing. It could result in reductions to the deficit. And if we have interest in holding folks accountable on tax evasion, I think we should be looking at the biggest fish we can across the board.
We're starting here today.
No, but we're having a hearing about accountability. But what I want to know is why it is folks have voted for cutting billions of dollars in order to let folks off the hook. So I'd be interested if we could have a hearing on the fact that the IRS has lost to attrition thousands of employees, including those with sophisticated skills.